The belt snapped through the dusk, and the little girl didn't flinch. She only lifted her wrist like she already knew how to show what mattered. Welcome to Facts. Before we start this story, tell us where in the world you are watching from. And if you believe kindness should never die, please subscribe and help us keep stories like this alive. The belt snapped through the dusk, and the little girl didn't flinch. She only lifted her wrist like she already knew how to show what mattered. At Miller's diner, the Cascade Hells Angels sat in a corner booth, leather creaking, coffee cooling. Griff, their president, rubbed his thumb along a scar and watched the light from the window slide across chrome. The men were tuned to small signs. They'd learned to read fear without the shouting. She crossed the room with a tiny, certain stride. Braid loose, sneakers weathered, jacket thin at the elbows. On her left wrist was a faded winged skull tattoo, ink soft from years of sun and washing. She touched it like a talisman and said steady, "My dad had that same tattoo." The booth emptied of sound. Griff asked the name. "Maya Mercer," she answered. She unfolded a photograph with careful hands. A younger shade grinning, cigarette at the lip, arm over Griff's shoulder. On the back, in hurried, uneven script, "If you ever need help, find them." The room smelt of grease and old roads, the paper smelled like rain. When Maya explained, her mother ill, bills stacking, landlord threatening, the room shifted. Shade had left years ago to build a life that might keep his girls safe. He'd died the previous winter. The men around Griff felt that old knot of responsibility. It made their jaws set. Griff set his mug down with a soft clack. "We got you," he said. The words landed like a motor firing, deliberate and inevitable. Around the table, men shifted. Harlan rubbed a knuckle raw on his thumbnail. Rue, quiet as midnight, mouthed the letters of the note like a prayer. Tommy swallowed and nodded. They were a promise in leather, and promises have teeth. Griff stood and folded the photograph into his palm like a fragile thing. He motioned for Maya to sit, and she did, small in the booth, a child beside men who smelled of oil and thunder. Her voice came out in pieces. Shade had left when her mother was pregnant. He'd moved north to try and make a life, and he'd sent that old picture with the note 3 weeks before he died. "He said you'd remember," Maya said. "He said you were his family." The name Shade had weight. Griff remembered the way Shade rode, fast, with a reckless grin, and how he'd argued once that leaving was a betrayal, and once that leaving was salvation. Memory is a strange ledger. The chips Shade left had value none of them had calculated. The chapter kept a small fund for emergencies, wrenches, gas, a busted kid's hospital bill. They weren't accountants, they were men who fixed what's broken. "What's the address?" Rue asked. Maya gave them an apartment number scrawled on a card, edges soft from being held. Coats went on, pockets checked. Outside, the diner bikes lined up like predators, engines humming low against cold air. People glanced, then looked away. When the patches moved, the town's little problems bent to another gravity. On the ride, Griff kept his eyes on the road and thought of Shade's choices. The leaving, the quiet life, the note. Sometimes being a man means stepping away from bravado to build something small and steady. The chapter rode without fanfare, a steady line of chrome and resolve, heading into an ordinary neighborhood that was about to change. The apartment smelled of disinfectant and fear. Ruth Mercer opened the door with oxygen tubing looping her cheek, eyes startled by a room full of black denim. She tried to laugh, and it came out thin. Maya stood behind her, clutching the photograph. Griff stepped in slow and sure and said Shade's name. Ruth's face closed around memory, and then she let it go and sat down. She told them about the cough that wouldn't quit, the job lost to sickness, the notices stacked on the table like threats. She apologized for dragging strangers into their life. "I thought you'd hate him for leaving." Griff shook his head. "A man keeps promises however he can," he said. "Shade tried to make something steady for you." They moved in 2 directions at once, practical and blunt. Harlan and Tommy pulled medical records, phoned clinics, sorted paperwork. Rue leaned into bureaucracy until a clinic agreed to review Ruth's case. The chapter gave immediate help. A few weeks' rent from a small fund, spare concentrator filters borrowed from past runs, rides to appointments. At Lerner's office, the landlord found his comm appended when 5 bikes idled, and men with flat temper sat at his desk. Maya watched as the men worked through the world she'd learned was hostile and watched small things begin to reshape. They did not make speeches or promises for cameras. They fixed crooked tubing, made appointments, leveled paperwork so the law had no soft spots to chew through. It was slow, steady help, the kind that keeps someone breathing long enough for life to catch up. That night the clubhouse smelled like oil, coffee, and worn denim. They made a room for Ruth upstairs, clean sheets, a lamp, a curtain for privacy. Maya curled on a couch with the photo on her lap, watching hands that had once been violent do small, steady work. The men moved through tasks. A cot set up, a kettle boiled, a friend finding a doctor who might take the case on faith. Griff tuned a spare Sportster and kept thinking of Shade's choices. He carried a folded patch in his jacket he hadn't worn since Shade left. Watching Maya sleep under a blanket that smelled of grease and safety, an ache in him settled into purpose. Rue read the letter aloud once more, Shade's awkward apology, his plea that his girls know where to go if they needed help. Plans formed without a meeting, a modest benefit at the clubhouse, a silent auction of parts and favors, a weekend ride asking for donations. Tommy rebuilt an engine to raffle. Harlan offered a week's labor to whoever needed home repairs. Rue called a friend at a regional hospital who owed him. They were not theatrical, they were stubbornly practical. Neighbors noticed. An older woman left a casserole at the clubhouse door. A kid from down the block watched the bikes and waved. A diner waitress slid a coupon into Maya's hand for school lunches. Those small gestures stacked like a net. Tommy taught Maya to check a spark plug at dawn, and she laughed until the sound made her face softer. It was not glory, it was hands meeting hands, trust measured in movements. The twist came in a shoebox beneath tour maps, an envelope with a photo inside. Rue thumbed through it slow. The image was yellowed, a bar parking lot snapshot with Shade in the middle, grinning, and at the edge a younger man whose jaw looked oddly familiar. Griff's chest went cold when Rue held the picture up. The man at the edge was Carver, the landlord who'd been tightening the screws on Ruth. The jaw in the photo matched Carver's now, years sunken in. No one had tied Carver to the road before. He'd been a small-time property owner, the kind who knew how to make money from paper. But the photograph put him in a different frame. A face from the road they knew, a man who'd once been near them and walked away with something raw between them. Old grudges fester, abandonment mutates into bitterness. Griff felt that history as a bruise. It explained the petty cruelty aimed at Ruth. The chapter's response shifted, not to yelling or threats, but to careful pressure. Rue sat with Carver later and spread the photograph, voice low and patient. He spoke of choices and consequences, and the fact that the past has a way of knocking on doors. They left Carver with a paid receipt for Ruth's arrears and a note, "Keep your hands off." It was a quiet correction, its force enough. Maya watched them reclaim something she hadn't known was missing. A direction, a defense. The night tightened like a fist and then opened. The men had come to protect what Shade had left behind, and they would hold it until the town had no leverage to hurt them again. They ran a quiet campaign for Ruth that felt more like patchwork than politics. The benefit was low-key. A Saturday barbecue, a band that knew 3 chords, a sign-up list on the bar. Tommy polished an old Sportster until it shone like forgiveness and advertised a raffle. Rue printed flyers and pinned them to telephone poles, while Harlan called in favors from people who still remembered when Men on Leather meant something in town. The clubhouse filled with donations, old tools, a hand-stitched quilt, a jar of bills folded tight. None of it was glamorous, it was everything. Word moved through town like temperature, slow, inevitable. People came because curiosity wanted to see the angels. They left because they saw men who kept what they promised. A schoolteacher slipped an envelope into Griff's jacket and said, quietly, "You keep her safe." A waitress from the diner brought extra pies, her fingers trembling because she'd seen how the men moved when someone needed them. Maya sold lemonade and handed change with solemn care, watching faces she didn't know soften when she said thank you. Carver watched from an office window across the street, his jaw working. He'd always measured power in paper, in notices served and signatures forged. The photograph had made him small in his own eyes. The men didn't glare. They smiled too easily in public to seem threatening. But the message was clear. Ruth had backers now, and backers who could ride and fix and make things right. The fundraiser pulled together enough to cover immediate needs: rent, a few bills, the deposit for a pulmonary consult. The doctor they'd found agreed to review Ruth's scans. The town's small kindness, combined with the chapter's stubbornness and bureaucracy, finally bowed in the right direction. Maya watched the money wrapped in an envelope and felt something like a hinge unfreeze inside her chest. She slept that night in a room that smelled like lemon and motor oil, and for the first time in months, inhaled without the heavy weight of dread. Griff sat on the porch after everyone left, smoking a cigarette he didn't want to finish. He thought of Shade's note and the strange geometry of choices. A man leaving to keep his family safe, other men returning to hold the line. He understood something then, without fanfare, that loyalty isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to be present when it hurts the most. The clinic called on a Tuesday with a voice that sounded like a hinge opening. They'd reviewed Ruth's case and a specialist would meet her, pro bono assessment pending a review of emergency funding. It was enough to make a room full of men who rarely cried look at one another the way people near the edge do, held open by a thin rope of hope. Rue drove with Ruth and Maya in his truck, the engine humming like a lullaby for the terrified. He played it cool, but his hands on the wheel were a little too steady, like nails driven too deep. The specialist was a woman, Dr. Lenora Hayes, with tired eyes and a manner that made paperwork feel like mercy. She examined scans, asked sharp questions, and then leaned back and said, "This is going to take money and time, but she's a candidate for intervention. The timing matters." She wrote a list of tests and a plan that felt like a map, and it landed on the table like a small, dangerous promise. Meanwhile, Carver started to make mistakes. He'd misplaced a payment ledger, misplaced a tenant file. Rue's casual conversations with municipal clerks unearthed zoning complaints and a string of code violations Carver had quietly ignored. The chapter didn't blackmail. They simply slid evidence to the city inspector and let the system do the convincing. Carver found himself answering uncomfortable letters. He blinked at notices that required mandatory repairs and fines. The man who'd built leverage with threats now had to fix roofs and replace wiring, expensive humility. Back at the clubhouse, Tommy taught Maya how to hold a wrench properly. She listened like someone learning a language. When she tightened the bolt, the engine coughed and then found its rhythm, like a held breath released. She laughed, short, surprised, and Griff looked at her and felt something loosen like a knot in a rope. The chapter kept working in the layers. Medical appointments, rent, legal pressure, small kindnesses. Nobody announced victory, they just moved the pieces until the board favored Ruth and Maya. It was a long game played with short moves. The first real test arrived when Ruth was scheduled for a biopsy. The appointment meant travel, an overnight stay, and the fear that the hospital's hallways carry in their fluorescent hum. Rue sat with her while nurses wheeled procedures and forms. Griff waited in the corridor, cigarette long finished, hands folded like he was holding a small animal. Maya sat clutching a leather bracelet Smoke had given her, the letters burned into it in a shaky hand. Shade, it was a weight and comfort at once. Ruth's voice when she spoke was small and honest. "I thought asking for help would make me weak." She looked at Griff like she expected a sermon. He shook his head. "Asking is survival," he said simply. "You do what you have to." The biopsy took hours, and everyone in the waiting room learned a new definition of patient courage from Ruth's clenched jaw and Maya's silent prayers. Results came slow, like winter. The specialist called them back with careful words. The disease was serious, fibrosis deeper than a first read had suggested, but treatable, maybe not with a transplant yet, but with therapies that could buy time and give quality. The chapter exhaled a collective breath that had been held for weeks. Harlan arranged bloodwork schedules and medication pickups. Tommy worked on a plan to help Ruth with physical therapy at the clubhouse when funds ran low. Outside, Carver's repairs were still incomplete, and the city sent another inspector who noted shoddy work. The landlord's attention split between legal paper and his own thin pride. The men kept the pressure calibrated, firm, legal, unavoidable. Ruth began to get better in small increments. Easier mornings, less wheeze when she climbed stairs, nights where sleep lasted longer than an hour. It wasn't a miracle. It was slow tending, the kind of care that stacks up into life. A new twist came in the form of a letter that arrived addressed to Shade's old road name. It was anonymous, folded tight, a confession of sorts from a man who signed only M. The note admitted to stealing from the group years ago, money that Shade had fronted to keep a friend out of trouble, and then fleeing with both debt and shame. The handwriting trembled. The pen had left little holes where pressure had been too hard. The confession didn't ask for mercy, it asked only that the truth be known. Griff read it twice, then passed it to Rue and Harlan. The past had teeth, it bit back. The men in the chapter had long memories, a ledger not of dollars but of deeds. The note explained a few old absences and patched a ragged seam in Shade's history. It didn't excuse everything, but it shifted culpability away from some who'd been blamed. There was a quiet satisfaction in clearing a name. The anonymous letter also carried a warning. The man who sent it hinted that Carver had old alliances, men who owed favors, and didn't like being shoved. The chapter adjusted its posture, tightened communications, and routed a few more favors through polite channels. They weren't naive. They respected that threats had shapes, and some of those shapes were people who kept less lawful company. Maya found the letter hidden under a copy of Shade's photograph. She read it with the furrowed brow of someone learning her father's history in real time. It complicated grief, made it broader and messier, but it also offered a measure of truth. Later, she asked Griff why Shade had left. He told her in pieces, a man who couldn't square two lives, a choice that hurt and healed in equal measure. Maya nodded like she finally had permission to feel both anger and gratitude at once. The chapter tightened the knot of protection around them, aware now that history could send loose threads that tugged at present safety. Winter pressed in with a thin, gray fist. The town's trees were skeletal, and the clubhouse heater hummed like a steady heart. Ruth's therapy required a regimented schedule, and the chapter altered its rhythm to fit. Shift rotations for rides, someone at the clinic, someone at the children's school events. The men became a kind of domestic architecture, supports where the house was failing. Maya's homework spread across the kitchen table. Rue graded it like it mattered, as if algebra could be an argument against despair. One evening, a local reporter arrived, a young woman with a notepad and a curiosity that smelled of coffee. She wanted a story about the angels helping a family. She didn't know the exact edges of the truth. Griff agreed to speak only if the article would be honest. He sat on the front steps, jacket open, hands rough and honest. "We do what we can," he said. "We keep promises." The reporter wrote down the words and looked at the men as if they might be a sermon or an anomaly. The piece ran, but not in the way anyone expected. It focused less on spectacle and more on smallness. The kitchen where Maya did homework, the hospital visits, the men who'd shown up with casseroles. The town read it and began to shift. Donations trickled in from neighbors who. Two men got out, stiff postures, boots too new, eyes that didn't know this ground. One spoke with a cracked bravado, "Carver wants to know when you're done meddling." The tone suggested a debt owed, some warped allegiance, old ties tangled with Shade's younger days. Harlan stepped outside, so did Rue. They didn't posture. They simply existed there, still and heavy in the dim light. Griff said, "We're done when she's safe." The men shifted, unsure. They had come expecting threats or fists. Instead, they got absolute clarity, spoken calm. Rue held out a printed packet, copies of the violations, the city's letters, the legal freeze on Carver's discretionary rent hikes. "Tell him the town's watching," Rue added softly. "He's out of leverage." The taller man looked down, the fight gone. Shame can be a quieter teacher than fear. They got back into the sedan and left without another word. Inside, Griff found Maya at the top of the stairs, peeking. She hadn't heard the words, only the silence between them. "Everything okay?" she whispered. Griff nodded. "Yeah, kid, you're protected. That's the beginning and end of it." She came down, hugged him without warning. Her small hands pressed into the leather of his vest. Griff froze, then placed a steady hand on her back. The clubhouse held its breath until she let go. Ruth's treatment stretched into months, respiratory therapy, medication adjustments, specialist calls at hours that bent the patience of even the calmest man in the clubhouse. Griff kept charts in his pocket, worn at the edges, a map of incremental wins. The doctor said the fibrosis had stabilized. Stabilized meant more time, time meant possibility. Meanwhile, Maya discovered a talent that surprised them all. Tommy had been rebuilding a carburetor, humming low, when Maya leaned over and said, "It's running too rich, isn't it?" Tommy blinked. She pointed to the fuel mixture screw. "It sounds like, I don't know, like it's drowning." She was right. He adjusted it and the engine smoothed into a soft, content thrum. Tommy stared at Maya like she'd just performed surgery without training. "Shade's kid," he murmured. That became the beginning of a ritual. After school, Maya helped in the workshop. She learned torque increments by feel, how to hear when a chain was ready to snap, how to smell when an engine was hot for the wrong reason. Rue found her reading Tommy's old manuals, eyes narrowed, lips pressed tight like Shade used to when he concentrated. She wasn't becoming a mascot. She was becoming a mechanic. Ruth watched these moments from the upstairs railing, oxygen tubing now only used on bad days. She felt something healing in her that medicine could not touch. Even illness can't withstand every kind of love. Some of it is too stubborn, too sure. Late one night, Ruth sat beside Griff in the quiet of the clubhouse while Maya slept. "You don't owe us this," she said. Griff didn't respond for a moment. He watched steam rise from his coffee. "Shade saved my life twice," he said. "This is just me paying interest on a debt that doesn't end." Ruth swallowed. "Does that ever feel heavy?" Griff finally looked at her. "Only when I forget why it matters." The next twist arrived in the form of a call from Dr. Hayes. Ruth's latest scans showed a pocket of scar tissue near critical structures, delicate but operable if they acted while inflammation was low. Surgery was optional, but waiting carried risks. Ruth listened while gripping the clinic chair until her knuckles turned pale. She had grown stronger. She was also exhausted from months of fighting. The decision was a cliff. Maya sat beside her mother, silent, small hand gripping Ruth's sleeve. Griff and Rue took in the medical jargon, the percentages, the risks. When Dr. Hayes stepped out, leaving them space, Ruth whispered, "I don't want to put anyone through more." Griff leaned forward. "It's your call, but don't ever think we can't carry the weight. We've carried worse." Ruth exhaled, long and trembling. "I want to live long enough to see her grow." That was the whole truth. Griff nodded once. "Then we're doing it." The surgery date was set. Preparations began like a military operation in slow motion, rides scheduled, medications purchased, backup plans layered. Maya packed a backpack. Shade's photograph, a book Smoke had given her, and a stuffed fox Ruth had sewed from old shirts. "For courage," she told Tommy, who pretended not to tear up. The morning of the surgery, the chapter filled the hospital waiting room again. They brought thermoses of coffee, small snacks, and the quiet presence of men who had spent years surviving night roads and hard truths. Maya curled into Griff's side, her breath shallow from fear. He rested a hand on her shoulder, thumb moving in slow circles like Shade used to when he calmed a wild engine. 6 hours later, Dr. Hayes walked out, face flushed but smiling. "She made it through," she said. "It went well." Relief rippled through the room. Tommy let out a bark of laughter. Rue bowed his head. Griff muttered something soft and private. Maya cried into her hands, her whole body shaking like it had been waiting months to finally collapse. Ruth woke hours later and whispered, "Is Maya okay?" The first thing she worried about was her daughter, not herself. Griff said, "She's right here," and when Maya leaned close, Ruth kissed her forehead with trembling lips. "You're safe," Maya whispered. Ruth closed her eyes and believed her. Recovery was grinding work, monitors beeping, physio sessions that pushed Ruth's limits, nights where pain gnawed but hope stayed intact. Griff walked the hospital halls like a man patrolling old territory, nodding to nurses who learned his name by the second day. Harlan handled discharge paperwork, arguing gently but persistently for home therapy support. Rue picked up medications from the pharmacy, reading labels aloud until Maya memorized dosages. By the second week, Ruth could sit up without wincing. By the third, she walked a full hallway loop gripping the rail. The chapter applauded like idiots when she returned to the room flushed and triumphant. Ruth tried to swat them away, but her smile broke through. Ruth returned to the clubhouse where the room upstairs had been winterproofed, new humidifier humming beside her bed. The walls smelled faintly of pine cleaner. Maya hovered like a vigilant bird, fussing over pillows and blankets. The men tried not to crowd her, but they hovered too, offering tea, soup, or silence depending on what the moment needed. As weeks passed, Ruth regained color in her cheeks. Her breathing evened out. She began sitting at the long table during dinners, laughing quietly when Tommy bragged about rebuilding an engine with duct tape alone. She talked more about Shade, about the guilt she'd carried, about all the nights she'd whispered apologies into the dark. Griff listened, letting her shape the grief into something she could hold. One evening, Ruth said softly, "Shade left because he loved us, but he also left because he didn't think he could be both a brother and a father." Griff nodded slowly. He thought he had to pick one road. Ruth fiddled with her ring. "I used to hate him for it. Then I learned how fear can twist decisions. And now," she looked at Maya, who was laughing across the room with Rue. "Now I'm grateful he gave her this path back." Griff leaned back. "He trusted us to catch you, took guts." Ruth's eyes filled. "Thank you," she said, "for not letting us fall." Spring warmed the clubhouse, filling the workshop with light that cut across the concrete floor in long, bright bars. Maya spent most afternoons there, handing Tommy tools before he even asked. She learned to diagnose a misfire by smell, to adjust chain tension by sound, to read torque specs like a second language. She wore a bandana to keep grease from her hair and Shade's bracelet on her wrist like a promise. Ruth grew stronger each week. She walked outside in the afternoons, sitting on the porch swing with a blanket draped over her lap. Griff sometimes joined her. They'd sit without talking, listening to the far hum of the highway like a steady heartbeat. Carver's situation deteriorated quietly. The fines, the mandatory repairs, the witnesses who'd come forward, all of it formed a slow collapse. One afternoon, he showed up at the clubhouse, shoulders slumped. Griff met him at the gate. Carver didn't posture. He just said, "I'm done fighting, I'm selling the building." Griff absorbed the words, nodded. "Make it clean," he said. Carver nodded back. "I'm tired," he murmured, and Griff saw in his eyes a man who'd been run dry by his own bitterness. On the porch later, Griff told Ruth and Maya. Ruth exhaled as if shedding years. Maya simply asked, "Does that mean we can go home again?" Ruth looked at her daughter, then at Griff. "We'll go wherever life is safe," she answered. Griff smiled faintly. "You got choices now, that's the victory." Ruth applied for part-time work doing billing from home, a gentle step toward independence. Meanwhile, the chapter planned a small celebration. Nothing big, just food, music, and the acknowledgement that they'd survived something together. Maya helped smoke hang lights across the rafters. Tommy grilled. Rue organized donations for families in town who'd been quietly struggling. When Ruth came downstairs that evening in a soft sweater and jeans that finally fit again, the clubhouse fell silent. Not because she looked different, but because she looked like someone who decided to stay alive. Maya stood close, hands clasped, eyes shining. Rue raised a glass. "To endurance," he said. The room echoed it, quiet, sincere. Ruth sat at the table, surrounded by the hum of men who'd kept her world from collapsing, and for the first time in years, she felt unbreakably safe. Summer rolled in thick and warm, pressing the scent of pine and asphalt into the air around the clubhouse. Ruth walked farther every week, her strength returning in cautious, steady increments. She insisted on helping with chores, folding towels, wiping tables, watering the little herb patch Smoke tended behind the workshop. The men pretended not to hover, though they all kept watch from the corners of their eyes. One morning, Tommy shouted from the garage, "She did it!" Maya, grease smudged on her cheek, had rebuilt a carburetor alone, every screw seated right, every gasket fitted clean. Griff inspected it twice, then nodded once. "Good hands," he said. Maya glowed. Shade lived in those careful fingers. They celebrated in small ways. A ride down to Creston Lake, Maya in the truck with Ruth, the men on bikes behind them like loyal shadows. Ruth sat on a bench overlooking the water, her breath deep and even. "I forgot how it felt to breathe without thinking," she whispered. Griff stood next to her long enough for her to know she wasn't alone. But the past wasn't done with them entirely. One afternoon, while Maya and Tommy worked, a battered pickup rolled into the lot. Out stepped an older man, scar down his jaw, clothes worn, posture shaped by regret. He introduced himself quietly, Mark, the anonymous letter sender. He'd come to say in person what he couldn't write. "I owed your father everything," he told Maya, voice trembling. "He fronted me money and vouched for me when no one else would. I ran from that debt. I ran from myself." Ruth stepped closer, protective but curious. Mark wiped his palms on his jeans. "I heard what you all were going through. I couldn't stay hidden. Shade was the best man I ever betrayed." There was no shouting, no threats, just silence deep and weighty. Finally Griff spoke. "Debt's paid, truth matters more now." Mark's shoulders dropped, relief bending him like a soft wind. Before he left, he placed a small metal key in Maya's hands. Your dad told me to give this to you if I ever grew the spine. It belonged to Shade's old lockbox, something Maya didn't know existed. That night, she turned the key in her palm until sleep took her. It felt like a doorway waiting to open. The lockbox was discovered exactly where Mark said it would be, buried beneath the false floor of an old tool chest Shade once kept in Griff's storage shed. Dust bloomed when Tommy pried it loose. Maya knelt beside it, her breath catching as the metal scraped open. Inside were pieces of a man she'd never gotten to know, a folded map with handwritten notes along the margins, routes, diner names, small stars marking places Shade had felt safe. A sealed envelope labeled for my girl, when she's strong enough. A thin stack of cash wrapped in a rubber band, old bills crisp at the edges. A locket, tarnished but intact. Maya opened the envelope with shaking hands. Shade's handwriting was uneven but unmistakably gentle. If you're reading this, I didn't get the years I wanted. I hope you got the ones you deserved. I left the road to give you a life with fewer scars than mine. But if you're here, it means trouble found you anyway. I'm sorry. I should have stayed longer. I should have taught you things myself. If the angels are with you, trust them. Griff is the kind of man people don't notice when they talk about heroes. He saved me more times than I can count. Let him guide you if you need guiding. And kid, ride when you're ready. The world looks different from a saddle, and sometimes it makes more sense that way. Maya pressed the letter to her chest, eyes wet. Ruth leaned over her daughter, tears sliding silently down her face. Tommy picked up the locket and clicked it open. Inside was a tiny picture of newborn Maya, red-faced and furious, wrapped in a hospital blanket. On the other side, a younger Ruth, smiling in a way she hadn't in years. Maya held the locket like it was a heartbeat. That night, Griff found her sitting on the porch steps, Shade's map spread across her knees. "You thinking of writing someday?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "I want to see what he saw." Griff took a long breath. Moving day came with sunlight and laughter. Tommy carried boxes 2 at a time. Harlan assembled a kitchen table. Smoke installed new locks without being asked. Griff hung curtains in Maya's room, blue ones that she'd chosen herself. But the moment that undid Ruth was small. Maya placing Shade's photograph on the new living room shelf beside a potted plant. "He belongs here," Maya said. "He does," Ruth whispered. The clubhouse didn't disappear from their life. It simply became one of their homes. Every weekend, Maya returned to help in the workshop, her confidence growing like someone discovering where their bones actually fit. Ruth visited often, bringing casseroles, checking oil levels, laughing more freely than she had since Maya was born. And the men, well, they behaved like uncles. Griff taught Maya how to judge distance in mirrors. Tommy picked her up after school once a week. Rue made sure she had the right textbooks. Smoke fixed the cabinet door every time it loosened, silently, like a ghost of good intentions. One evening, as the sun dropped low, Ruth stood at her new balcony watching Maya ride her bike in circles below. The laughter floated up, light and sure. Ruth placed a hand over her heart. "I didn't think we'd ever get a life like this," she said softly. But they had. And the road that led here, worn and broken as it was, suddenly felt blessed. In October, the chapter hosted their annual open ride, a community event meant to bridge misunderstandings about patch-wearing men on loud machines. Families came, local businesses set up booths, and kids got to sit on bikes with wide eyes and wider smiles. Griff insisted Ruth and Maya come, not as guests, but as family. Maya helped at the registration table until Tommy tugged her sleeve and said, "Come on, gear up." She blinked. "For what?" He handed her a small leather vest, sized for her, patched only with one word across the back, "Supported." Maya's breath left in a soft gasp. She put it on with careful reverence. Griff crouched to meet her eyes. "Today, you ride with us in the truck. Next year, maybe on your own bike." The convoy rolled out, 50 bikes deep, engines rumbling like distant thunder, stitched into a chorus. Ruth rode in the cab beside Griff while Maya leaned forward between the seats, eyes wide at the sea of chrome behind them. Halfway through the ride, they stopped at a bluff overlooking the valley. The sun angled low, hitting the handlebars like sparks. Griff motioned Maya over. "Your dad loved this spot," he said. "Used to say the wind tasted different up here." Maya closed her eyes, testing the air. It did feel different, cleaner, older, familiar. Ruth stood beside them, breath steady in the breeze. "Shade would be proud," she whispered. Griff's jaw tightened, softened, then loosened. He'd be proud of both of you. The ride ended at the clubhouse where food waited, music played, and neighbors lingered with easy smiles. Ruth danced a little awkward, gentle, while Maya played cards with Smoke, who pretended to lose each hand. Under the string lights, Griff watched them both and felt the rare, quiet ache of something like peace. Shade's absence hung there, yes, but not like pain, more like a shadow that softened the light. And the chapter stood around them, not guarding out of obligation, but out of choice. Winter returned, softer this time. Ruth's checkups showed continued improvement, her lungs healing as well as anyone dared hope. Maya kept up her studies, her workshop hours, her growing understanding of who her father had been and who she was becoming because of him. One night, near Christmas, the chapter gathered for their private holiday meal, a long table, mismatched plates, candles burning low. Griff tapped his fork against a glass. "We've had a year," he said simply. Heads nodded. They all knew the weight of that understatement. He looked to Ruth. "You fought like hell." Ruth smiled, eyes warm. "I didn't fight alone." Then he turned to Maya. "And you reminded us why we do any of this." Maya's cheeks flushed. She clutched Shade's bracelet. "You saved us," she whispered. Griff shook his head. "Kid, your dad saved us a long time ago. We're just keeping the circle going." As the night stretched, someone suggested stepping outside. Snow had started falling, thin flakes drifting like ash. The chapter walked out with Ruth and Maya, breath fogging in the cold air. Maya tilted her head back, eyes catching the snowlight. Ruth curled an arm around her shoulders. The men stood near, boots crunching on fresh frost. Griff looked at them, mother and daughter, alive and steady, and said softly, almost to himself, "Shade kept his promise." Even now. Maya reached for his hand. He let her. In that quiet snowfall, the angels didn't look like outlaws or legends or guardians. They looked like what Shade had always believed they could be. Men who carried each other's burdens so no one walked alone. And under those slow, drifting flakes, Ruth and Maya stood safe, held by the family they never expected, but now could never lose. Sometimes the family we think we lost finds its way back through the people who keep a promise. If this story touched you, ride with us, subscribe, like, and join our family.